Hello, Brabs. We're back with another entry into the Bürgermeister's daughter. We left off with Anna feeling very sad. Well, not sad, but she was whoring around. Erasmus was too, and he found out about Daniel Troutwain, and so he claims that Anna's father did as well, but he had nothing to do with it, which sounds like hogwash, but let's get on with it, bruv. Daniel Troutwain, although Anna could not have foreseen it at the time, nor controlled the consequences of her actions, when Daniel Troutwain, she could have, entered her life, forces were set in motion that would destroy her relationship with both her father and Erasmus. Troutwain is the most intriguing, but perhaps only because his story is far the most difficult one to tell. Contemporary chroniclers describe his father, Daniel Sr., as a chronicler himself, and the last Troutwain to reside lifelong in All. Another Daniel Troutwain appears in the city's records as a young noble mercenary hired by the city in 1474 for 120 gulden per annum to fight the city's feuds and perform its military obligations to the emperor in the company of other young noblemen. That the two are the same man is a most appealing thought, but lacks proof. It is clear, however, that earlier in its history, Daniel's family had been Jewish. Its coat of arms, which he continued to display, portrays the bust of a man wearing a wide Jew's hat, tied with a string under the chin and set against a red background. The colors, white head on red background, may indicate the family's earlier purging and conversion to Christianity, an indication perhaps of their having been washed by the blood of Christ and thereafter made pure. Jews had been in Hull since the mid-13th century, working as salt makers and as money lenders. The name Troutwain, in one variation or another, appears in the city records only a few times in the 14th century, and then only one early and late. By the 1430s and 1440s, however, several families of Troutwains, I know I'm butchering the name, but whatever, Troutwains were settled there. Their near total absence from the city after mid-century can be explained by the persecution and exile of Jews almost everywhere during the peak years of the Black Death, 1347 to 1350. Although there had been earlier expulsions of Jews from Christian towns, for example in France in 1182 under King Philip the Tooth, and in England in 1290 under Edward I, the unprecedented Order of the Black Death inaugurated an equally new and nasty relationship between Christian and Jew in medieval Europe. For centuries, forces, many subterranean, had prepared the way for that change. In their sermons and at festivals, Christian preachers routinely portrayed Jews as betrayers of Christ. From making great loans to princes to renting books and clothing to students, the practices of Jewish moneylenders provoked both envy and hatred among Christian borrowers. And leaders on both sides adopted policies of virtual segregation. Jewish leaders because of the exclusiveness of their religion, and the Christian penchant for proselytizing among and persecuting Jews. Christian leaders out of fear that Jewish culture and religion, if allowed to flourish on their own in too close proximity to Christian, might overwhelm the latter with their antiquity, richness, and wisdom. Already the tens of thousands of aristocratic Christians who made up the armies of the First Crusade, 1096 had attacked Rhineland Jews while en route to the Holy Land, and in 1215 the Fourth Lateran Council, which promulgated such lasting features of medieval Christianity as the dogma of transubstantiation and mandatory annual confession, also set discriminatory guidelines for Christian contact with Jews that might also be considered something of an assault. The council wanted Christian relations with Jews to be limited to the necessary economic dealings between merchants on each side. It forbade sexual relations between members of the two faiths, and Jews could not be placed in positions of authority over Christians. The council also restricted Jewish worship, basically keeping it out of sight, and discouraged the building of new synagogues in Christian cities. And while not exactly recommending ghettos, the Great Church Council proposed segregating Christian and Jewish communities within the same town. By the 16th century, major pogroms had occurred in Spain between the 1390s and the 1480s. Perhaps three-fourths of the Jewish population there chose to become Christian conversos, rather than be exiled from their homeland by a determined church and crown. But having converted, they were then suspected, not without reason, of being Christian in name only, and the converted Jew became more feared and hated by his Christian neighbors than the Jew who chose exile. Having greater security, power, and proximity to Christians than ever before, Spain's converted Jews suddenly became a Trojan horse within Christian society, a situation that resulted in the expulsion of the conversos as well in 1492. The history of Hull's Jews is the European story, a microcosm. There, too, the terror of the Black Death combined with centuries of religious prejudice and hatred of Jewish moneylenders to make the Jew scapegoats for the city's misfortune. A sizable community existed in the city in the first half of the 14th century. Living on their own street, the appearance of the plague in 1348 gave rise to accusations that the Jews were poisoning the city's wells and committing unspeakable crimes against Christians. The crisis peaked in 1350 when some Jews were accused of ritually murdering a Christian child. A group deemed responsible were herded into the Neuberger Tower on a hill by the Langerfeld Gate at the southeastern wall of the city, where after being tortured, they suffocated and burned to death as the dilapidated tower was burned to the ground. In the aftermath, the city expelled its Jews and confiscated the properties and goods. Because imperial law forbade pogroms, the emperor fined all 800 gulden for the action, but in a manner that may baffle a modern reader. Dukes Eberhard and Ulrich of Württemberg received the commission to collect the money, which they deposited in their treasuries. Not a single pfennig was given to Hull's exiled Jews, whose confiscated properties and goods became, by imperial decree, the city's to keep and enjoy as its own. The intention of the fine had been to punish the city for breaking imperial law, not to compensate Hull's Jews for the injustice the city had done them. Imperial law, not jewelry, but had been the offended party and thus received the damages. Although a few Jews could be found in Hull in 1370s and 1380s, and more lived in the surrounding countryside, there would not be a true Jewish community in Hull again into the 19th century. By the time our story begins, Daniel's family had long since integrated itself into Hull and was part of the city's Christian establishment. As a doctor of canon and civil law, Daniel's brother Eitel died 1536, was as learned as a man could be in the late Middle Ages, and he occupied important ecclesiastical and civic positions, canon in Worms, prior in Neuhausen, and dean of the nearby Comberg Monastery, as well as a lower judge, assessor, in the Imperial Supreme Court. Daniel's career track, by contrast, has been strictly secular and military. Basically, he was a mercenary and by all reports exceptionally good at his work, gaining his reputation as a crack cavalryman during service with the Swabian League in the 1520s. The League was a confederation of princes, cities, counts, and knights created in the late 15th century to maintain law and order in southern Germany. It visited swift and harsh punishment upon both noble and plebeian lawbreakers. In the 1520s, it was particularly the latter whom the League confronted. In Swabia, in Franconia, the vast majority of peasants rebelled against their secular and ecclesiastical landlords in 1525, culminating decades of determined but lesser protest. They did so in the name of some of Martin Luther's most popular teachings, particularly the freedom and equality of all Christians, and the right of local congregations to choose and depose their own evangelicals, pastors. Although the peasants' own goals were far more material than spiritual, it was a political and social revolution, not a religious one. Peasant leaders opportunistically seized upon Luther's spiritual egalitarianism to further them. Still, Luther's teaching gave the peasant cause a new dimension, enlarging its goals beyond the mere restoration of traditional privileges and property, which the German prince's policy of territorial centralization had been eroding for decades. Inspired by the Reformation, the peasants envisioned their release from serfdom. Good luck, because Christ has set all men free and demanded the right to renegotiate their contracts with their lords as virtual equals, again in accordance with the alleged teachings of Christ. Such notions were, however, completely contrary to Luther's theology and anathema to 16th century rulers, and both condemned them as dire threats to what civil peace and other order society then possessed. The peasants had virtually no supporters outside of their own ranks. Only a few farm-oriented city dwellers and artisan dissidents, and once they had rebelled, the call for their suppression was both loud and nearly unanimous in South German cities and territories. In the region around All, peasants first revolted on April 2nd, 1525, in the village of Bronsbach, north of the city, just as the men there were fetching their pregnant wives from a traditional fish meal prepared by the local miller. There, the assembled peasants learned that the peasant militia had revolted in Rothenburg, whereupon they, too, decided to lend a hand to divine justice and formed their own units. Marching through the surrounding villages that evening, they called upon their neighbors to join with them in the fight for their rights. Area peasants particularly resented having to pay a percentage of their produce, fruits, vegetables, milk, cheese, butter, and flax, and livestock to their lords in so-called small tithes. A variety of church taxes vexed them almost as much. Inspired by local leaders, prominent among them Johann Waltz, a Franciscan preceptor turned revolutionary preacher, peasants were soon plundering and burning the castles of noblemen in the countryside around Hall, setting the stage for a major confrontation with the Swabian League. To their great regret and misfortune, the lords who had for so long taken such advantage of their peasants had also given them arms and taught them basic military strategy and tactics. They did so with the intention of using peasant militias as emergency forces in lieu of standing armies, whose provisioning was expensive and behavior often unpredictable. When the peasants now revolted in the lands around All, their lords found themselves confronted by armed men who knew something about making war, not the helpless but freedom-loving rustics sometimes portrayed in modern history books. When they besieged an area, village, or town, peasant bands first stormed the churches to silence the bells and to seize the small cannons in the steeple, which were the first line of defense against external attack. Thereafter, they occupied the parsonage and the Bürgermeister's house, incapacitating the local leadership and breaking the chain of command. By such tactics, a number of local pastors were forcibly conscripted into the peasant army, among them Hall's contemporary chronicler of these events, Lutheran pastor Johann Harold, 1490 to 1562, who had little sympathy for the peasant cause, despite incessant peasant efforts to win him over during his captivity. By the time Hall's walls were threatened, its militia of 400 to 500 men faced a besieging peasant army 9 times their number. In the weeks before the assault, the city became a beehive of activity, as every strong-bodied person joined in the hasty repair of the walls, digging the trenches around them deeper, and stockpiling stones for the catapults, sulfur and pitch, lanterns and gunpowder along the walls. And then there's several towers. Culverins, long guns, and other artillery were strategically placed at every street gate and tower, places where the city was most likely to be penetrated. On the day before the assault, April 1st, members of the city council went out to the peasant leaders to warn them not to revolt, promising to help them reach their legitimate goals peacefully if they put down their weapons. The die, however, had been cast, and neither side was disposed to compromise. The peasants proclaimed their defiance on their clothing and banners displaying white crosses in taunting imitation of the soldiers of the Swabian League, with whom they knew they were destined to clash, and on whose uniforms and guidons red crosses were emblazoned. What Hall's militia lacked in numbers, however, it more than made up for in field guns, which the peasants lacked. Attacking in the dark of night on April 23rd, as the church bells pealed the Ave Maria and their 5 cannons lit the night sky, Hall's militia routed the peasants in an easy initial victory. The war, however, was not to be so short. With his numbers soon increased by fresh recruits from Limburg, the peasant army regrouped and besieged the city a second time. After a 2-month standoff during which the city was supplied by the Swabian League and able to build up its forces, the besieging peasant army was crushed. In the aftermath, the city punished peasant households throughout the region with fines of between 6 and 60 gulden, depending on the size of a holding. 7 of the peasant leaders were beheaded, 4 had fingers severed, and holes were burned in the cheeks of Chew, marking them as rebels and warning of future imitators. In Oringen and Neuenstein to the north, the peasants were more successful in the short term, defeating both those towns and forcing the 2 Hohenlohe counts to swear allegiance to them. The counts were invited to think of themselves as the peasants' brothers, as they would no longer their lords. I don't know what that means. Contingent of surviving peasant soldiers from Hall region fled north, eventually to join a massive peasant army then besieging Wurzburg. En route, they made an early detour to Weinsberg and Württemberg to participate in the massacre of Duke Ludwig of Helfenstein and his knights. In vain, the Duke had tried to buy his life before he and 23 other noblemen and their servants were herded into a field and executed. Also rushing to Wurzburg at this time was the 25,000-man army of the Swabian League, with Daniel Trautwein very likely in its ranks. The great force also stopped in Weinsberg to revenge the massacre of the noblemen there. The occupying peasant army was annihilated, and its captured piper, who had piped the killing of the noblemen, was tethered by a chain to a stake encircled by a fire and left slowly to roast to death, as the League marched on to Wurzburg to slaughter still greater number of peasants. Such was the violent world of Daniel Trautwein. He served his lords with distinction, killing rural noblemen for Duke Ulrich of Württemberg. A man of so many crimes and atrocities that it took his enemies 1,000 lines to memorialize them in rhyme. And rebellious peasants for Count Palatine Ludwig. While aide and secretary to Duke Ulrich, Daniel wrote a locally famous vernacular poem in the Duke's defense, perhaps the only kind of words the Duke received from a contemporary after his abortive attempt to subjugate the imperial city of Reutlingen. He had brought about the occupation of Württemberg by the Swabian League and the Duke's own humiliating exile. We're actually going to talk about Daniel here. In the first days of Hall's peasants' revolt, Daniel's cavalry unit led the assault on the peasant militia in the woods around Königshof, and Daniel got the credit for the first kill. After the war, Count Ludwig appointed him lifelong bailiff, Amtman in northern Boxberg, 45 kilometers from Hall. In recognition of his distinguished service, Boxberg was a castle town with a particularly bloody history. It was the home of a famous renegade nobleman, Thomas Absberg, who feuded with the Swabian League throughout the 1520s. In 1521, he killed a League member, in retaliation for which the League razed over 20 castles in Franconia, Swabia, and elsewhere that were either associated with him or suspected of similar banditry. Castle occupants who resisted such purging faced loss of life. Boxberg was among the castles targeted for such disciplinary action, and while it was well fortified and provisioned, its militia surrendered to League soldiers without a fight. Those soldiers thereupon burned the castle and sent ashes from the fire to Count Ludwig, its titular lord, as documentation and to allow him to savor the victory. This was the castle rebuilt and refurbished that became Daniel's residence. The transition to the new post did not, however, go smoothly, as Daniel's name turned up on a list of people suspected of supplying the Habsburg faction there with food, shelter, and arms during the years of the feud. In the summer of 1527, the League ordered Daniel, along with 15 others also suspected of collaboration, to appear at its annual meeting in Ulm and take a purgation oath. That ceremony required a public hearing of the charges against one and a sworn denial of them in the name of God and all the saints upon pain and death of eternal punishment. Daniel, however, did not appear for the ceremony, citing pressing business, and begged the League's indulgence. He was among several penitents the League excused for what it deemed to be a legitimate reason. At its scheduled meeting in Ulm, it referred his case to his patron, Count Palatine Ludwig, for a private purgation at a later date. It was at the height of Daniel's military career between 1522 and 1524 when he was so efficiently killing factious noblemen and rebellious peasants for the Swabian League that he tenderly courted Anna. Like Erasmus, he corresponded with her often and over an extended period of time. While none of her letters to him has survived, 19 of his to her exist as undated copies made by notaries for the hearings held by the imperial commissioners at mid-century. The original letters were among those found by her father in the fall of 1525. At his death, Hermann Buchler passed them on to his son Philip, who later, 1550, submitted them together with Anna's correspondence with Erasmus to the Machtold Commission in an effort to discredit his sister's character during the Buchler family dispute over inheritance. Even though there are no surviving letters from Anna to Daniel, Daniel almost always writes in direct response to Anna. So his letters also tell us something about what was on her mind at the time. Daniel's letters vividly document Hermann Buchler's reaction to the pair's behavior and his low estimate of Daniel. They also document Daniel's promises to stand by Anna and not abandon her to the mercy of her father. This despite his own dread of confrontation with the fearsome Bürgermeister, whom he recognized to be capable of doing them both a great deal of harm. Daniel had an equally great dislike for Erasmus, and not only because of the jealousy created between the two by their sharing of Anna. They had other things in common that divided them as well. In their different ways, each was a mercenary. Erasmus, at a more glamorous and commanding level, befitting his higher social rank as an imperial shank. Daniel at a somewhat grubbier and more subservient one, corresponding to his as an ordinary cavalryman. For all of Daniel's ferocity on the battlefield, as a lover he was far the kinder and gentler of the two men, and was a better companion to Anna. That he was in his early 40s and almost twice as old as Erasmus, then in his early 20s, when he courted Anna in her mid-20s, probably had something to do with that. He did not, of course, have the close personal association with royalty that made Erasmus so fascinating to Anna. He did not, like Erasmus, attend dinners at imperial diets, where royal guests teased him about his secret love and asked him how pretty she was, no doubt after much boasting by Erasmus. Nor was Daniel ever in a position to send Anna real-life sketches of the emperor. In these regards, Daniel and Anna had something in common that favored their relationship. Neither of them was royalty. They wrote to each other in the same language without separate forms of address designating superior and inferior. She could approach him comfortably as her social equal, and even acted as his benefactor when he ran short of cash, as he frequently did. Whereas in time of need she went begging to Erasmus, who was a none too willing creditor, despite his taking money from her in her better days. Daniel easily sponged off her. One of the reasons for her stealing from her father may have been to assist her new love. Daniel also frankly shared his personal failings and ambitions with her, something Erasmus rarely did, and then with perhaps ulterior motives. If the testimony of witnesses can be believed, she and Daniel were natural comrades in mischief, each ready to throw caution to the wind and defy respectable society. Nonetheless, Anna came to doubt the sincerity of Daniel's profession of love as much as she did Erasmus's, although in Daniel's case her doubts were more easily assuaged. This was because Daniel stuck with her through thick and thin. When the relationship with her father began to deteriorate, he arranged a consultation for her with the city's secretary on her legal rights as a dependent dote. Like her father and Erasmus, he begged her in his absence to mind her conduct and not allow herself to become again the subject of gossip. Still, by comparison with her relationship with the other two men in her life, Anna's relationship with Daniel was one of greatly diminished criticism and diminished intention. This was true even though Daniel knew about her continuing involvement with Erasmus, whose presence in her life he resented every bit as much as Erasmus did Daniel's appearance. On 3 separate occasions he asked her to stop seeing Erasmus, threatening in the end to abandon her if she did not. Because Erasmus looked on Daniel as his inferior, his jealousy was apparently a matter more of hurt pride than of a broken heart. Daniel, on the other hand, seems truly to have cared about Anna, despite once threatening to smash her big mouth. If she did not break off the relationship with Erasmus. Herman Buchler, of course, knew about his daughter's cavorting with Daniel before he discovered her affair with Erasmus. After he learned that she and Daniel were raiding his wine cellar and carousing late into the night in his absence, Daniel had a more difficult time seeing Anna than did Erasmus. Thereafter, she and Daniel were under her father's watchful eye, and he fumed at them both privately and publicly, all the while completely unaware that Anna was also deeply involved romantically with Erasmus. Not until he found Anna's private letters did he realize the variety and overlap of his daughter's amorous activities. Daniel's letters to Anna appear to have commenced after her father discovered the full extent of the nocturnal life and barred Daniel from the house. That would most likely have been in late 1523 or early 1524. Shortly after New Year's Day, 1524, Erasmus, who had known about Anna's relationship with Daniel for at least a year, wrote to inform her that her father now knew what she and Daniel were really doing. Courtesy of her new lover's big mouth. Letter 23. Several letters comment on what are described as Herman Buchler's false accusations and their vendetta against them. As the Buchler home was now off limits to Daniel, he, much like Erasmus, had to arrange secret rendezvous elsewhere. Quite a few letters are written from nearby Leofels, just northeast of Hall, where Daniel was apparently stationed in the castle of George von Velberg, a knight who was then organizing area forces against peasant rebels in Rothenburg, and for whom Daniel now rode. Outside of all, Daniel and Anna seem to have met most often in Leofels. I don't know how to say that Persian word. Especially when she traveled north to her maternal home of Rothenburg, just over the border in Franconia, which was another meeting place for them when both were in that region. And Daniel also intercepted her along the road when she traveled to other destinations. In addition to the absence of letters by Anna to Daniel, this correspondence differs from that between Anna and Erasmus in its narrower preoccupation with arranging secret meetings, surviving Anna's father, and making ends meet. There is small comment on the larger world around them and little information about what each is doing. Daniel takes quick aim at Anna's heart, not at her head. The letters convey caring, devotion, and passion, and seek assurance of her loyalty and love in return. Save for planning rendezvous, he does not instruct her, and his only criticism is leveled at her continuing contacts with Erasmus. All right, bruv, that's all for now. See you tomorrow. Goodbye.